Hello, listener. Welcome to Juniverse Cheating Stories. Please subscribe for more videos.
Ethan had always thought of their home as a sanctuary, a place where love was nurtured, laughter filled the halls, and family bonds were strengthened year after year. It was the house where their children took their first steps and where he and Isabel had grown old together in the simplest, most honest way. But standing there now, in the very same living room, everything felt foreign. The air was thick with betrayal, and the walls, once filled with warmth, now felt like the confining grip of a nightmare. 3 months earlier, Ethan's world had been flipped upside down in a single moment. He had returned from a long, exhausting shift at work, expecting the usual comfort of home. Instead, he was greeted by Isabel, her face pale, her eyes distant, as if the woman he once knew had been replaced by someone unrecognizable. Beside her stood Greg, his friend, his confidant. The man Ethan had trusted like a brother. Ethan's heart pounded as the realization hit him like a slap to the face. His life was over. Without a word, Isabel handed him divorce papers, a restraining order, and a suitcase containing his belongings. It wasn't just the tangible things, the clothes, the photos, the memories that cut deep. It was the silence between them, the look of icy detachment in her eyes. The woman he had loved, the mother of his children, was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize, and she was standing next to the man who had stolen her from him. Isabel's voice trembled with false remorse. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen," she said. But her words were empty, lifeless. There was no sorrow in her eyes, only a cold, calculated indifference. The more she spoke, the more Ethan realized the depth of her betrayal. And then there was Greg, the man who had stood by Ethan's side through thick and thin. His words still haunted Ethan, sharp like a knife in his chest. "I know this is painful, man," Greg had said, his voice full of false sympathy. "But I never wanted this to happen." Ethan's blood boiled, his hands trembling with rage. The audacity of Greg to stand there, to speak to him as if nothing had changed, was too much to bear. The betrayal wasn't just Isabel's, it was Greg's too. And yet here he was, acting as if he hadn't destroyed something irreplaceable. The following weeks blurred into an agonizing haze for Ethan. His heart ached with every passing moment. But he was determined not to let it break him. He found a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest place, nothing like the life he had shared with Isabel, but it was his. He had taken a break from his career as a marketing executive, unable to focus on anything but the crushing weight of what had been stolen from him. His lawyer had been blunt. Isabel would likely win primary custody of their 2 children. She had been the stay-at-home mom, raising their kids while Ethan worked long hours to provide for the family. And while Ethan had always thought he was doing the right thing by being the sole breadwinner, the reality of the divorce made it clear that his financial stability wouldn't matter. Isabel would keep the house, though she would have to buy him out of his share. Ethan couldn't fathom how she would manage that, especially with Greg's modest pension from his military service. But at that point, he didn't care. The house, the money, none of it mattered. What did matter was his retirement savings, the one thing that had been his lifeline through all the years. Isabel had made it clear she wanted a piece of that too, and that was where Ethan drew the line. He would fight for that with everything he had. But for now, he had to focus on something more immediate, surviving the emotional wreckage she had left in her wake. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found solace in the quiet of his new apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. He spent his days going through the motions, trying to make sense of a life he no longer recognized. The rage that had burned so fiercely in him at first began to subside, replaced with a hollow sadness that gnawed at him. But no matter how deep the pain, he knew he had to stay strong for his children, for his own sanity. The battle was far from over. He had no idea how long it would take to heal or how much he would lose along the way. But one thing was certain, he would never let Isabel and Greg win. The day Ethan had been dreading finally arrived, the day he was allowed to step back into the house he once called home, to reclaim the remnants of his life. The place that had once been filled with love, laughter, and memories now felt foreign, like a stage for a play that had already ended, its script unwritten. The moment he entered the door, he saw Isabel standing in the hallway, her posture stiff, her face a mask of icy detachment. Beside her stood Greg, his self-satisfied smirk barely concealed as he leaned casually against the doorframe. The man who had destroyed everything was here, and Ethan felt his heart squeeze in his chest. But he refused to show it. A court-appointed supervisor stood nearby, the only buffer between them, his presence adding a cold formality to the tense atmosphere. Ethan stood tall, maintaining a calm exterior as if the storm inside him would never break. But his silence was a mask. Every fiber of his being screamed to confront them both, to tear down their facade and expose their lies. Isabel, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, broke the silence first. "Ethan, I know you're hurting," she began, her voice forced, her eyes avoiding his. "But we really need to talk. I think if you just listen to us, you'll understand why everything happened the way it did." Ethan's lips curled into a thin, almost cruel smile. "Listen to you?" he repeated, his voice low and cutting. "You think I'm going to sit here while you two spin this into some kind of fairy tale? The truth couldn't be clearer, Isabel. You're with Greg now, and I'm nothing but a casualty of your selfishness. Don't expect me to feel sorry for you." Greg, ever the brave man when Isabel was around, straightened up, taking a step forward, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "Ethan, just hear us out," he urged. But Ethan didn't give him the satisfaction of even acknowledging his presence. "No," Ethan growled, his voice thick with fury. "I'm done hearing excuses. You can pretend that everything's fine all you want, but deep down, you both know the truth. This isn't some misunderstood moment, Isabel. This was a choice. Your choice." Isabel recoiled, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You're just bitter," she spat, her face twisting with contempt. "You don't understand how hard this has been for me. Greg is my soulmate, and you were just a chapter in my life, Ethan. A chapter I've closed." Ethan's anger surged, boiling over. "Your soulmate?" he snapped. "You mean the man you've been sleeping with behind my back for months? The one you've lied to me about? The one who you've been sneaking around with like a coward? I saw the texts, Isabel. I heard you laughing with him while I was out there working my ass off to provide for you and the kids." The truth hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the room felt suffocating. But Ethan wasn't finished. Ethan had been holding on to this moment for so long. The fury that had consumed him in the days and weeks following the betrayal had finally boiled down to one thing: revealing the truth. Now, with Isabel and Greg standing before him, pretending to be innocent, he would finally show them who they were. Without a word, Ethan pulled out his phone and began scrolling, his fingers tapping the screen with a deliberate calmness. Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly unaware of what was about to happen. Ethan handed the phone to Greg, his lips curling into a grin that was anything but friendly. "Here," he said coldly. "Take a look at this." The video began to play. It was from their wedding day, the happiest day of Ethan's life, or so he had believed at the time. Isabel was standing beside him, gazing into his eyes, and in front of their family and friends, she spoke the words that once filled Ethan's heart with joy. "You're my soulmate," Isabel had said in the video, her voice full of warmth, her eyes shining with affection. "I've waited my whole life for you. You complete me." Greg's face drained of color as he watched, the smug smile he had been wearing vanishing as the weight of the truth settled on him. Isabel froze, her fingers trembling as she reached for the phone. But it was too late. Ethan's voice rang out in the room, sharp and unforgiving. "Is that the same woman who is now claiming Greg is her soulmate?" Ethan's voice was steady, but his eyes blazed with fury. Isabel opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. Her mouth worked in silent desperation as she realized there was no escaping the truth. But Ethan wasn't done. Not yet. He turned to Greg, who was now visibly uncomfortable, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the revelation. "You want to know what else I know?" Ethan said, his tone cold and menacing. "Isabel wasn't just cheating on me with you. She was engaged to another man when I met her. Did she tell you that? Or are you too blinded by your own fantasies to see the whole picture?" Greg's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You're lying," he said, though his voice wavered, betraying his doubts. Ethan's eyes glinted with a cold, dark satisfaction. "I met her ex-fiancé, Greg. He told me everything that Isabel had conveniently forgotten to mention. And you know what? It doesn't even matter anymore. You two are dead to me. You're both nothing but strangers, and I won't waste another second of my life on you." The silence in the room was deafening, the weight of Ethan's words hanging like an oppressive cloud. Isabel looked from Ethan to Greg, her face a mixture of guilt, fear, and frustration. She knew she had no defense left. Her lies had been exposed, and there was no going back. Isabel's face flushed with rage, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and fury. Her eyes narrowed as she struggled to hold back the oncoming storm of words. "This isn't fair, Ethan," she spat, her voice trembling but full of defiance. "I wasn't the only one at fault. You've made mistakes too, you know." Ethan's expression twisted into something cold and unrecognizable. His anger, which had been simmering for months, finally boiled over. His voice was like a whip crack as he responded, the words cutting deeper than any physical blow. "No, Isabel, I trusted you, and you crushed me. You don't get to sit here and pretend you're the victim. You've taken everything from me, everything we built together. You destroyed it all." His eyes bored into her, and for a moment, the weight of his words seemed to hang between them, unspoken but undeniable. Isabel's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to find the words to justify herself, but they never came. Ethan's gaze flickered to Greg, who stood frozen, looking like a man caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. "You want to call her your soulmate?" Ethan sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Fine, but remember, she was engaged to someone else when she met me. And when we first met, she was already lying to me, playing me for a fool." Greg's face twisted, and his mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. The cracks in his composure were widening, and he couldn't keep up the facade of being the good guy anymore. The truth had shattered him, and there was no denying it. With a final, bitter look, Ethan turned on his heel and strode toward the door. Every step felt like a weight lifting off his chest. But the pain still gnawed at him. He was leaving behind the broken remnants of the life he thought he had, a life that was now a shadow of its former self. As he reached for the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "You two are dead to me," he said, his voice low but final, each word like a death sentence. "And I'll never forgive either of you." He slammed the door behind him with enough force to rattle the walls, the echo of his words lingering in the air long after his footsteps faded into the distance.